Hi everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits and I'm here with Dyer Supplier to dye some fun, non-repeating, variegated and speckled yarn. We are going to have so much fun playing with jacquard acid dye colors on the Dyer Supplier 7525 sock yarn base. This yarn is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon. It's soft and luxurious, and it dyes like a dream. So let's go get started. I pre-soaked the Dyer Supplier 7525 sock yarn in some plain tap water for 20 to 30 minutes. Today we are going to focus primarily on jacquard sun yellow and chartreuse. But we are going to add a little bit of hints of some emerald, spruce, and navy blue in some sharper speckles on the yarn. Make sure you check out the Dyer Supplier website for a complete collection of all 40 jacquard acid dye colors, so then you can have a huge palette of colors to play with, or just pick a select few of your favorites that you can pull from over and over.
Since we are dealing with dry dye powder today, in addition to wearing gloves, I am wearing a respirator mask and safety glasses for personal protection. From both the sun yellow and chartreuse, I'm taking just a nice aliquot of the dry powder and setting it aside into a cup. The jacquard acid dye containers are a little too small for me to poke my fingers in, and plus when we're in a really steamy environment, I don't want to contaminate these containers with moisture, which is why I'm setting it aside in these cups. For our more subtle colors, I have added a teaspoon of citric acid powder into 3 different containers. And I'm taking a little bit of the dry acid dye powder and mixing it up with the citric acid. This is diluting the dye while dry and will allow us to get some more spread out and sharp speckles on our yarn.
You can dilute the dye in even more citric acid powder to spread things out even further. It's all ultimately the choice, but I find that it is a lot easier to manually spread out the speckles when they are mixed in with the powder. I'm adding the 200 grams of pre-soaked yarn to my full-size catering steam pan. This chafer pan is 4 inches deep, stainless steel, and I absolutely love it. Before I added the yarn to the pan, I added 6 cups of plain tap water and 1 tablespoon of white vinegar. And I'm now just sort of spreading this yarn out as much as possible. These pans can accommodate 300 grams reasonably, but I prefer to do 1 or 2 skeins at a time because I find that I can spread things out more and get more coverage. Now, we are a little less than low immersion. You can see there's plenty of water to cover the yarn. If you want the colors to spread out less far, then use less water. Maybe start with 3 or 4 cups of water, just making sure that there is plenty of wet around the edges. I'm going to heat this yarn up until we're really steamy, just below a boil.
We are going to start by layering on some of the sun yellow and chartreuse dye powder by pinching up a little bit from the cup and adding it lightly, but not too lightly, onto the yarn in some fairly random patches of color. I'm using a heavier hand here now than I would use if I was just trying to speckle with the color. And then coming in with a dedicated dye spoon, I am going to help these colors spread out a bit. You could play around with randomly adding colors like this with pre-mixed colors, but I find something very playful and almost finger painting like doing it this way. And plus you don't have to have stalks mixed in advance. Now, you don't necessarily need to wash your hands before switching colors. I do have some dye on my hands, and so I'm actually going to gently tap some of the edges to remove that excess dye. But I do want to dry my fingers before going into the next color. We're not worried about color transfer today as much as we are worried about just making the dyes damp too soon, and then it makes it harder to spread them out. So if I weren't going to move things around, you can see that we're getting some speckles already with the chartreuse, and that is fine, and you could leave it and let it sit for a few minutes before tapping it out, which will leave some of these speckles on the yarn, but they'll be more subtle because we'll get more color spread. But we are also going to be going in and adding some other more like subtle speckles on after. And so again, it's worth just playing with it and seeing how fast or slow different colors strike. One other thing it's worth noting is that I'm dyeing 200 grams of yarn here in the same pan, but these aren't going to be identical colorways. We're adding the dyes in a random fashion, so when you knit or crochet with this yarn, their colors won't exactly repeat. But you will get, they will be similar, but if you were going to use both of them in one project, you would probably want to alternate skeins to maximize the, or to minimize the difference between the color changes. And you can leave, obviously, you can leave as much white as you want behind, but we will be flipping the yarn probably 2 to 3 times, adding more color, and so that will help minimize the white. Using the straight powders, we already have some really cute, fun speckles on our yarn. So we don't necessarily need to go into the citric acid that we mixed to add on some more contrasting speckles. But it is a really fun technique and is so easy to add just small but more pigmented pops of color onto the yarn. So what I'm doing is I am just grabbing a small pinch of that powder and gently rubbing my fingers together on top of the yarn. And you can see that as these little pieces fall, we're getting these sharp pricks of color. It takes a little bit of time for it to dissolve and hit the yarn, but really each time I pick up powder, I'm picking up just a tiny bit, so that way I don't overdo it. Of course, you can overdo it intentionally, and that is also beautiful and fun. And so it's sort of like sprinkling like a little bit of salt onto something where you don't really want too much, but a little bit just adds those fun speckles onto your yarn. Of the 3 colors, I am feeling the most heavy for speckles with the emerald color, because it is the smallest amount of contrast, but it'll give some really nice interest and depth into our colorway. But again, I am mostly randomly distributing these colors onto the yarn, and so when we're pulled back, you don't see it very much. But when you look closer or off camera, you can really see those beautiful specks. Now I am going to let the yarn sit for 5 to 10 minutes. The colors should be pretty well set already just from this time of speckling, but I like to pause and wait so that way I allow these speckles time to set, because if you move it too soon, you could get the wash of color like you saw with our beautiful base that we started with.
Once we had waited 10 minutes, we picked up the yarn, flipped it, and went through the same process of adding the colors to the other side. Again, you can add as many or as few speckles as you like, or leave it with the soft speckles you get just from playing with the main colors you're spreading out. The whole process is honestly so much fun and really brings you back to childhood and feels very much like finger painting to me. Even though you're using a spoon, you're still using your fingers and hands a lot in the process. If you prefer, you could use a dedicated dye salt shaker or dusting one to apply the speckles. I prefer to use my fingers because I feel that gives me the most control, but different dyers have different preferences for how they achieve the look. As the process goes on, if you feel like the water level is getting low, I would add more water and vinegar around the edges of the pan. To get the sharpest speckles when your powder is mixed with citric acid, you want the yarn to be as close to the surface as possible. If there is water over the yarn and the dye hits the water first, the colors will spread more and you won't get that sharp speckle. And then finally, once you're satisfied with the color, if the water level is really low, I might add more water and vinegar just to make sure all of our powders are dissolved, because that'll make life easier later when you wash it. Now that we are happy with our yarn color, I am going to turn off the heat and let the yarn cool off completely before we wash it. Removing the yarn from the dye bath, you can see that all of the color is in our yarn. And now we can go wash it. Once your yarn has cooled completely, we can wash it to make sure that there's no extra unbound dye or anything like that. Ooh, this is so pretty. The chartreuse and sun yellow have almost a day glow to them. I'm going to add a tiny bit of some dish soap. Sometimes adding the soap can cause some bleeding to happen, so it's better to know right after you've dyed the yarn than to discover something later on. But yeah, this is looking great, and I'm not seeing any bleeding. So I'm going to go ahead and rinse the soap out and hang up the yarn to dry, and I'll come back and take a closer look. Here is the finished dry yarn. We have these beautiful random patches of the neon green and yellow, really, with these tiny speckles all around. The speckles are so sharp that you don't even necessarily see them from far away, and ooh, I love that punch of color. Having options with your premixed colors is great when you are playing around with this technique of using the dry powders to dye the yarn. However, you can mix your own colors and apply that randomly, and you can create a similar random base and then use maybe a couple of your favorite colors to speckle on top. So you still have unlimited possibilities without getting the entire collection of Jacquard acid dye colors. If you played with the same colors I played with today and you have a black light, you should go and check it out because chartreuse is fluorescent. Playing with dry dye powders like this is honestly one of my favorite ways to dye yarns. I love dyeing by feel and letting the colors lead the way, doing these random non-repeating colorways. However, you can absolutely use this technique and get something that is more regular and repeating. Just instead of adding your dyes randomly in the pan, focus where you're adding the powders in sort of strips. And this was done with the same colors in the same kind of way, adding the colors just into more striped sections than randomly all over. Once you learn all the rules for making sharp speckles, then you can have fun and break them. Obviously, don't break any safety rules, but try speckling with a more full immersion, with deeper water, or add your speckles on and then move the yarn right away and see how you get speckles with the wash of color that surrounds them. When we were layering colors today, I used a mixture of straight powders and powders mixed with citric acid, but you are definitely not limited to that. You could use only dye powder straight from the jars, or you can mix all of your powders with citric acid and go really light and really heavy in places and play with the different kind of colors you create by layering all that together. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and if you want to see me play more with yarn and color, you can find me on the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel. There will be a link in the video description. Go and check out Dyer Supplier's website for all of your bare yarn needs. In addition to the 75-25 stock base that we dyed today, there are so many other fun bases that are ethically sourced and affordably priced. And the more you buy, the more you can save. There's some awesome wholesale options that are available to everyone. I love using the Dyer Supplier yarn bases for my colorways, and they're coming out with new yarn bases all the time. So you really should go check it out and maybe even sign up for their newsletter. Thank you so much for watching, everyone.